Monday night, and this is Graphic Policy Radio, the podcast where comics and politics meet. This is the show for people who know that Superman arrived in the U.S. as an unaccompanied minor. This is your host, Ilana Levin, a.k.a. Ilana Brooklyn, and I have a new microphone, and I hope that works out well for everyone involved. I'm joined tonight with a really special guest, Eisner-nominated comics writer Chris Sebela. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge that this week has been truly horrific. But it is also Pride Month, which means it's as good a time as any to remember that when people stand together and when people are brave, we can achieve great things. If you want to feel inspired tonight, you should do what I just did a little bit ago, which is check out the hashtag Poor People's Campaign right now, or I suppose after this is done. And you can see regular people reviving Dr. King's campaign for economic justice and doing small and great acts, and it's incredibly inspiring, and you can find ways to plug into that in your own community. And speaking of that, we're going to be talking with Christopher Sebela in just a moment. He's writing some really fascinating comics with a lot of political subtext, actually, and I can't wait to dig into it with him and with you. So a little bit about Chris. He is a two-time Eisner-nominated writer, designer, and publisher living and dying in Portland, Oregon. He has co-created books like Crowded, Shanghai Red, House Amok, Evolution, Heartthrob, High Crimes, Welcome Back, little parentheses, Dead Letters, as well as publishing his comics Short Order Cooks and The Death Defying through his two-headed press. He also writes things in other people's sandboxes like Ghost Rider, Harley Quinn, Kiss/Vampirella, Detective Comics, Captain Marvel, Injustice, Ground Zero, and Demonic. He is catnip for weirdos, and every fan, every dog contains toxic amounts of caffeine, and you should follow him on Twitter, which is STOP, unless you're a jerk, in which case you should definitely not follow him on Twitter, and you should avoid both of us. So, Christopher, hello, and welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you. I can't believe it's taken me this long to reach out to you because I've actually been following your work for a while, and I'm glad this timing was pretty perfect for us. I think I first heard about you when you released Hearthrob. What year was that?
That was 2015? Yeah.
2015. And that was really exciting to me because I really love anything that's set, anything good, I should stipulate, that's set in like the 60s and 70s is always a sweet spot for me. And you had a really exciting heist story going on in that space. And I'm really glad to have you on to talk about your two latest series in particular, Shanghai Red and Crowded. So I guess I just start for folks who might not be familiar with your work. How did you get started writing comics?
I don't know. I've always written all my life, and it was right around 2009 when the economy collapsed, and basically I was working freelance as a graphic designer, and all my jobs were going away, and I kind of had no idea what I was going to do, and all I knew for sure was that I could write and write well, and that it was the only thing I ever really wanted to do. So I thought, I'll take half of my savings, move to Portland, where I know there are two comics publishers and a bunch of comics people, and try to break into comics. And that was in 2010. So yeah, pretty much from the moment I got here, I started working on trying to get into comics. And then, it was about a year later that I finally busted in. So
that's fabulous. How did you learn how to write a script?
I had a co-writer initially, so he helped me out a lot with that. And also I just knew a bunch of comics people. So I think I hit up Matt Fraction and I was like, hey, I'm writing my first comic script and I have no idea what I'm doing. So I think he sent me his first Iron Man script and a short list of things I should not do and things I should do. And that was, I wrote those lessons down on a whiteboard. I read through the script a couple times and then I just started, and it's been trial and error since then. I mean, it's pretty easy to pick up, but getting good at it, has taken me a little longer. So.
Actually, I recall you were part of the first or maybe second class of the DC Writers Workshop.
I was in the first class, the pilot program.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I did that in 2016. Yeah. So yeah, I was part of like the initial group that they were, I guess, testing out the concept on. So we were all the guinea pigs. But that was really cool. Like, 13 weeks of listening to Scott Snyder tell you how to write superhero comics. Like, there are definitely worse ways to spend your time.
What was your, did you have like a pitch script that you used to I don't know if the word should be try out for the workshop?
No, because it was the pilot program, like they were approaching people, so I got approached.
And you had comics out at that point, so.
Yeah. I mean, I was a couple, like, yeah, I was pretty established by then, I think. I mean, as established as you can be in comics.
Well, that's cool, though. I've been interested in the workshop as like a vehicle for bringing, new voices into the industry who might not have access to some of those audiences otherwise.
Yeah, and it's been, I was in the class with Vita, Ayala, and they're writing, I think they just wrote a Supergirl for DC, and I know they're doing other stuff for DC, so... And I think Vita's a great writer, so that was really cool to see, and just the collection of people. Like, it wasn't all comics people. There were a couple people who had never written comics before, so it was an interesting mix. And I think you get people who've never written comics before will ask the questions that maybe you, as somebody who considers yourself somebody who knows what they're doing, would never think to ask. And it kind of can occasionally like open things up in an interesting way.
I can see that. It actually brings me to a question I was about to ask when we're talking about your series Crowded, which is your character Vita named after Vita Ayala?
Yes.
Because they're both pretty badass.
Yeah, I stole her name. I told her too, and she was totally on board once I showed her. I think once I showed her the character designs, she was...
Yeah, I can imagine them being on board with that. If folks don't know who we're talking about, I did have Vita on the show to talk about the Wilds not that long ago, and we actually also had them on to talk about their work for DC before that, so go give it a listen. But I had to wonder, I said, this is a badass person who might have been named after a real person that you and I both know. So I guess let's talk about Crowded. Crowded, I had literally no idea what to expect when I picked this up. I had not paid attention to any of the press. Sorry. I'm really glad I did that because... I'm sorry?
I said, no, that's fine. I don't pay attention to the press either. So.
I try to be better. I mean, like, you're not media. It's not your job to. But I hadn't seen it, and then I started to read this, and as about one page into it, I was completely struck by how what you're writing is an amazing, violent, funny satire of the gig economy, as they call it, or really more accurately, a continuation of the exploitation economy that has now been given a fancy, colorful veneer through various web apps that people work on. But your story is incredibly political and very bonkers, and I really, really enjoy it. So I guess what the question with Crowded would be, is this how do you describe the series? Because that is what it felt like to me. Like, this is a not too distant future of very believable satire of what it's like for people trying to survive with 8 different gig economy type jobs, driving 5 different Ubers and things like that. But what if you turn that up a notch and introduce some particularly organized violence or unorganized violence, etc., because your character is being pursued by people who want to kill her for $1 million.
Yeah, I mean, I think it works as a satire. I think it just works as a straight out action adventure book. I mean, I very much fell into the mode of doing kind of a buddy comedy. I think it's a little bit of a horror book at times, and a little bit of sci-fi. I always call it 10 minutes in the future, because I don't precisely know, I don't have a year set in mind of when it takes place. Like, it could literally be next year, or it could be 7 years. But yeah, I mean, it's very much, the weird thing is that I've been calling it polyconomy, which is another fancy word they've given to it. But that was kind of an afterthought. The initial idea was just this idea of crowdfunded assassinations, and like the idea that, crowdfunding has taken on so many roles in our society. And it just felt like, well, it seemed inevitable at some point that, all the good that's being done with crowdfunding will inevitably find a way to turn it bad. And so that was the initial concept. And then, the more I thought about it, the more this like juggling 8 to 12 different jobs every week. One, it spoke to me as a freelancer. I don't do all the things that Charlie does in the book, but, I hustle a lot and I worry a lot. And I don't know, everything just kind of came together in this sort of perfect way. Like I didn't set out to make a satire. We didn't set out to make a relevant book. Like, I just had a cool idea that I thought would make for a really good comic, and it's turned into what it's turned into. But for me personally, that's the best way for me to approach books. If I had said to myself, like, okay, this book's going to be a satire of, this and that, it wouldn't be as good as it is, because then I'd have that like pressure on me of like, am I doing enough to sell that? I tend to write from my subconscious more than anything. And just like, sometimes I don't even know what the themes of my book are until like I'm almost done writing it or after it's come out. And then it's like, oh, of course, like it should have been obvious to me. But yeah, that's how I approached Crowded, was, just sort of taking in everything that's swirling around us and trying to make something entertaining about that, that also, has its roots in the world that we're living through right now.
Wow, that's interesting. I guess, you're definitely someone who's really engaged in online spaces, so there's always a certain amount of political radiation or context that's going to be part of that. And I definitely thought that there were lines that I saw that felt like commentary on some of the more, strident moments that we see. Like there was, I'm definitely trying to keep this episode out of any sort of too deep spoilers with respect to either of the series, but I don't want to go completely light and vapid when it comes to talking about plot. So hopefully we'll strike an okay balance. But you have a character who talks about people putting out death notes on other people because they made small social violations, and how it sort of went from having a directed mob of people who were going after people who were really in power and really doing danger to others, namely like government officials who were corrupt and horrible. And then people started realizing that they could also crowdfund to put a death note out on all kinds of other folks. And I definitely saw that as like, that feels particularly like a critique of people using the amount of social media combativeness that we would use perhaps against a corporation or a lawmaker, and then directing it against like a fellow regular person who doesn't have, a 20,000 follower account and, doesn't have,
No, a lot of it was influenced. The story I that's stuck in my head and still sticks in my head that like influenced Crowded was, I can't remember her name, but it's the woman who tweeted, going to Africa now, hope I don't get AIDS. And then she got on the plane, and then the thing blew up, and, everybody was against her. Like, you couldn't find a person online who agreed or, said like, hey, maybe we should cool it down. Like, it just swept up the internet. And meanwhile, she's on a plane. She has no idea what's happening. and she gets off to her entire world is on fire now because of one thing she did, and that I guess like that really stuck with me. And as far as like how to approach Crowded is very much like, you can do something super innocuous. You can cut a guy off in traffic and he can be petty enough and angry enough to like take it out. I mean, we see it every day, people taking these small slights and, it turns into a vendetta, whether it's justified or not. So yeah, I mean, a lot of that really contributed to how I saw the world of Crowded shaping up. And it seemed inevitable to me that, something that would start with these sort of noble, as flawed as they are, these noble goals of like, we're going to take the power back and put it back into the hands of the people, would inevitably like bleed down to like, well, I don't like my ex and, he's getting all up in my business, and so I'm going to open up a campaign on him and see if anyone else out there can't stand him, and we'll kick in a couple bucks.
Yeah. I mean, I also can't imagine being someone who felt like they could just make a statement that was that racist on Twitter and that there wouldn't be any sort of response. But there's a question of proportionality, like how important is she? And it's easier for folks to go after her, and she's a racist. It's easier for folks to go after this random racist lady than it's for them to go after a lawmaker who's racist and has perhaps a greater imprint on the world,
Yeah. And that's, I think that's where the initial idea of the crowdfunding came in, was this idea of like, that we are, all of us, I think to a large degree, we all feel very powerless these days, because, and have for years and years, because we don't really control our society. Politicians do, and they don't answer to us. They answer to, lobbyists and their party leaders. And it felt like, well, this would be the quickest way to democratize things, is if every person in power out there knew that that somebody could reach out and touch them if they didn't listen to the people who they work for, that, it would start to change the world a bit. But, these changes are never limited. They don't just like stop at the fence line. They keep going. So I kept going with it.
Yeah. I mean, that I think that's why it's such an interesting satire. When it came to sort of putting the book together in the first place, how did you develop your two main characters of the buddy comedy?
I mean, so for a long time, I was like, I kept debating. I mean, I just thought it was going to be about a main character, and then I quickly realized like I couldn't have that I needed a foil for them. I couldn't just have them bouncing off of random people. And then I came up with the idea of like the Uber for bodyguards, and I was like, oh, this fits perfectly. So I'll just get a bodyguard with her. And then, so just sort of setting up these basic relationships that make sense. And then for characters, I always tend to do really deep dives. I will spend pages and pages in a notebook, like writing out their life history and things that like happen to them, and things that drive them. And yeah, I think once I realized that I was leaning in the direction of a buddy comedy, it became a lot easier to, figure out how to put two people together who don't hate each other, but, just like they don't fit well together. It's like a bad puzzle piece. And then once the dynamic got locked in, then it was like, oh, this is great. Like I could write this book all day long, every day, especially once like Ted and Ro sent in their designs, and their designs like did half the work, because, Vita is very like angular, and intense, and Charlie is very curvy and soft. So like we already have these conflicts sort of built into their just who they are as human beings, and then yeah, I don't know. It just like, you know, these things just kind of snowball, and I can't really tell you at what point, you know, it turned from like what was a really dark sci-fi book into this, what is still dark, but is like definitely more funny satire road movie thing we're doing now.
Oh, that's interesting. When Ted Knight and Rosie,
Ted Brandt and
Ted Brandt,
Rose Stein.
Sorry,
That's okay.
Probably called him a character from a comic book. So they've been on an art team for a while. I know they worked on Princeless and Raven the Pirate Princess and some of those comics, which I love a lot. How did you end up teaming up with them on this?
So that's all down to our editor, Juliet. Juliet and I have been friends for a couple of years now, and she is a retailer. Like, she worked at Fantastic Comics in Berkeley. And after a while, I started sending her some of my stuff to read and just like get her take on it before I would send it in to my editors. And her feedback was always really good. And so then I started developing some ideas, and I asked her if she wanted to come on as an editor. And she said yes. And then that thing never came through, but she is friends with Ted and Ro. And she said, well, they're looking for something. I can put you two in touch, or you three in touch. And so, yeah, she put us in touch. I sent them 2 pitches, one of which was Cold War, and the other was Crowded, and they chose Crowded, which I'm really grateful they did, because like I can't imagine anyone else drawing this book now.
Yeah, their look is very stylish, and I like the descriptions you did with Vita and Charlie. Vita is really hot. I'm sorry, it's just a fact.
No, that's fine.
I mean, that's the point right now. But it's really great to see sort of an androgynous female character. You know, she's not white, and that's just, she's like a central figure in the book. And then her contrast with Charlie is incredibly pink. She's like the pinkest individual.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, it just, you know, I knew that, yeah, I don't know. I knew I didn't want it to be, you know, a super white book, because we already had like, you know, like the white girl sort of as the figure that everything swirls around. So yeah, like, I don't know, like Vita was just more interesting. I tend to write characters from a place of like, I think my main directive is that they're not like me, as much as possible. So I tend to write a lot of women characters because, you know, this is just my take, but I feel like there's a certain, what do you call it when you put a car, when you like push cruise control? There's a certain sort of cruise control when you're writing characters who are like you. So I don't want to just write, one, I think there's enough white dude stories out there, and two, I don't want to fall into that trap of like, oh, well, I know what a white dude thinks because I am one. Writing women and writing people of color is like, it forces me to, you know, exercise all of me as a writer. It's not just my brain coming up with plots. It's, you know, things have to emotionally feel right to me and logically feel right to me. So it makes me work harder, and it makes me attached to my characters more. So yeah, like Vita, you know, from the get-go, you know, she was always a woman of color, and she was always pretty androgynous. And there's a lot of sort of androgyny running through the book too. and we treat it as naturally as possible. That was my other thing, and the same with Shanghai. It was like I didn't want it to be like, this like, hey, look at this. I wanted to treat everything as baseline normal as possible. And have it, it's a part of who this character is. It's not a part of the story, like we're not going to stop and like explain, why this person is the way she or they are. I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm always happy to see just a lot of general LGBTQ characters flowing around a story. And, Vita is not the only LGBTQ character in the story. There's background characters and couples everywhere. And it's just part of the actual world that we live in that way, too.
Yeah. And it, that's mostly, I don't know, definitely the gay agenda is pretty high on my list for what I like to write about and creator owned. So yeah, like that. With this book though, we have a lot more variables sort of in play. So it's a bit more, I don't know. I'm sort of extending myself a little bit more with this, but I started doing that in Heartthrob too. Like, I mean, I just sort of like very casually put in that there's a 3-way going on with Callie and like 2 of her gang members. And it's, I don't know, just trying to like, I don't put this stuff in there to be like titillating or, I'm trying to make all this stuff seem as normal as it is to me, to the worlds that I'm building.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Well, I definitely wanted to, emphasize like queer artists and writers in Pride Month most of all, even though I feel like I do it about 50% of the time anyway. So happy to have that be part of the conversation here. I know it kind of feels a little bit 101 sometimes to be discussing it, but sometimes you have to wonder, like, if this is somebody's first episode where they've really paid attention to that question or not. I don't know.
Sure.
But yay, these are good things. And yeah, I really do just keep like a hand count of how many butch presenting female. I think Vita identifies as female, although I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that definitively.
Okay. Well, there aren't enough. There are very, very few characters that look like Vita in comics in general,
right,
including characters who, personality-wise, are written as such. When pen comes to paper, as it were, they suddenly look hyper-femme and drawn for a heterosexual male gaze, and it's really, really lazy and stupid.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the advantages I think we have on Crowded, and I tried to make it this way, is that Ted and I are the only dudes on the team, so we're outnumbered. So like we Ro and Juliet and Cardinal and Triona, like they're not gonna let it be even on accident, turn into something that it's not. So, I mean, but yeah, I don't want to do any sort of like male gaze book. So I've been lucky enough to have female artists on books that happen to have like queer women in them, and usually artists who are queer also, which I feel like, okay, good. Like I have somebody there who is going to call me on my shit if I goof up and do something wrong. And I still do stuff wrong. And, Juliet has been really helpful in pointing out like, this doesn't read right to me. So, I still have tons to learn. And luckily the team is sort of built in a way that, that takes a lot of the mistakes out of the equation.
That's really great. When you're working on the inset page in the beginning of each issue, and you always have a lot of puns and lines written into the story with different kinds of background companies. Do you have? I feel like you must keep some sort of running log with all of the most insane puns that could possibly be used for such businesses? Or am I projecting?
No,
I
like a lot of it is also, it's just Ted and Ro putting stuff into the book. So I don't want to take credit for their work. Like they do a lot of, like all the TV listings. Like the only one I contributed was a limb adoption, which is an idea I've had for a decade now.
Wait, one more time, say that again.
A limb adoption.
Oh, yeah.
There used to be the show on called Eliminate, where it'd be like one bachelor and like 3 women, and during the course of the date, he would dismiss the other 2 women, and or the woman would dismiss the 2 dudes and like end up with the final one. And I had this really dark version of it called a limb adoption. That's the only one I'll take credit for. But yeah, like Ted and Ro are putting in stuff on their own, and it always hits the right tone. So yeah, I just, the stuff that feels important, I will mark it down, but it's all very ephemeral. I mean, it's the same as our world. Like none of this stuff, it's all interchangeable, like Monster Energy drink could be the same as Rockstar Energy drink for all it really matters.
I enjoy Crispy Kremlin though. Those are definitely.
Yeah, I was really happy with America's Next Top Bottom. Like I was not expecting that joke to show up. So I give them points all the time.
Thank you. Well, I definitely want to make sure we have a lot of time to talk about Shanghai Red, which is a comic that very much caught me off guard. I again, hadn't been reading my promo materials, so I just opened it up immediately, taking a look at this is really a historical fiction adventure story of revenge and incredibly powerful. Going back to the very start of the story and looking at the setting and everything like that, I don't really know that I've seen any other comic that is taking place in this particular part of history. You're looking at, what was it, 1890?
Yeah.
About 1890, and you're opening up with sailors on a ship. I actually got my dad to check out the comic with me because I wanted to talk about some of the historical visual references with him. He's like, yes, that ship is probably a lot older than 1890, but that makes sense because those ships are always at sea for a very long time before you replace them. I'm like, oh, very good point, thank you. So opening up with the sailors, and there's a uprising amongst the Shanghai sailors on the ship, and they take it over. This is one where it's like impossible to talk about it without spoiling it.
No, and
you can talk about this in your promo text. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a character who decides that they're not going to go along with another tour of servitude on the ship that they were kidnapped and forced to work on. Gosh, I feel like we should explain what being Shanghaied means. Do you want to take that for our audiences?
Sure. Shanghaiing is a practice that happened in the mostly the 1800s, where ships needed a certain amount of sailors on board before they went to sea, and a lot of their sailors, when they would dock, would just like wander off or wind up drunk somewhere and never show back up. So there were people called crimps who were basically in charge of gathering up sailors, and they would, for all intents and purposes, sell them to the ship captain for $50 a head. And a lot of these people were drugged and kidnapped and like woke up on a boat in the middle of the ocean. Some of them were tricked into boarding houses where they got overcharged for everything. So then in order to pay off their debt, they had to go work on this boat. It was basically a slimy way of getting free labor, and the way that the naval laws were, once you were on a boat working on it, you couldn't leave. Like there were greater punishments for sailors leaving their post than there were for people kidnapping people and turning them into sailors.
Yeah, it was definitely a form of slavery,
Yeah.
even if it was not a permanent state of being for the people who were involved in it. I mean, there's still Shanghaiing happens, not so much. I mean, obviously there's forced labor in America, right? But Shanghaiing, in fact, in terms of sailors in particular, still does happen in other countries. But
Right.
I was doing a little bit of research before this. I was like really wanted to know how and when it was that we finally cracked down on the practice being so dominant, because as you showed in your story, Shanghai was so common that it was basically part of the economic system of port cities, right?
Yeah, I mean, there were a whole boarding house upon boarding house was built just to fleece sailors, and yeah, those places were, they sent a lot of money to the city. So especially in places like Portland, the city government just kind of looked the other way.
And you mentioned one of the things you mentioned something that inspired you working on this book was when you moved to Portland, you'd heard about the Shanghai tunnels that were dug underneath the buildings in town.
Yeah, that's really like where. So it was 2014, and it was right after Emerald City Comic Con, and Declan Shalvey and Jordy Belair had come down to Portland to visit, and Jordy and I are really into ghost stuff. So I suggested, I was like, hey, we should go to the Shanghai tunnels because it's been on that show Ghost Adventures, which both of us love, even though it's completely stupid. So yeah, we all went on the tour where, you go through this sort of, it's a grate in the sidewalk underneath a restaurant called Hobo's. And there's just like a small section of the tunnel that used to be down there. And there used to be a network of tunnels all through Old Town Portland, which were built basically to help get shipments from the Willamette River to the middle of downtown without having to navigate traffic and everything. But the tunnels also became home to the Chinese Tongs, basically set up a lot of their illegal industries down there. And then the story slowly became that these tunnels were used for Shanghaiing and that people were locked up down there. And until, a ship needed them, a lot of which is like historically very wobbly. And most people say it wasn't used for that, but the tour itself was interesting enough. And like, there were so many visuals, like a pile of shoes, like that they would allegedly had stripped off of sailors that they had kidnapped, and it just left down there. And there were sort of cages, and I don't know, by the time we got back above ground, I had the opening of the story in my head. And from there, then I just had to do a buttload of homework to make sure I was doing it right.
And I mean, if the story was just the story of Shanghai sailors and their experiences, I would feel like it was something that was really important to exist and to be read, but I would not have the emotional ability to read it.
Sure.
But what you have instead is a story that begins that way and then puts one of those characters on their revenge against the motherfuckers who did that in the first place. And so that is definitely a thing I can get behind. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wanted to start it off like, I mean, that those first 5 or 6 pages, like I had them in my head pretty much right away. And yeah, because one of the things they told us on the tour was the idea that when you got Shanghaied, it wasn't a forever thing. Your contract would last 2 or 3 years. And at the end of your contract, the ship's captain would come up to you and say, hey, you can sign back up to work with us, and this time we'll pay you. Or you could say no, and we'll drop you at the next port we land at, which, somebody from Portland, some poor soul getting dropped in Shanghai, China, like, there's no way they're getting back home. Like, it would be a miracle if they did, and it would take, a decade at least. So, yeah, like, that just seemed like, wow, that's no choice at all. and the only choice would be to just like flip out and kill everybody. So I was like, oh, okay, cool. It's a revenge story. And then, but you know, I knew I wanted to write about a woman character, and that, you know, women weren't normally shanghaied, which is why the book became what it did.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we have it was just really hundreds, if not more, you know, historical stories of you know, people who were you know, born women and, you know, lived as men during that part of the country's history, serving in the military, serving in all kinds of capacities. So while it's not common, it's certainly not without precedent.
Yeah.
To have someone disguised like that. And, you know, it's always a question when you're talking about it in terms of, if we were talking about real historical figures, I think the challenge of how, do you want to identify this character as being trans in some way is a different question, because obviously our modern categories aren't the same.
For sure.
As, but this is fiction and you've invented this character. So I've been thinking about this in light of how we talk about this comic, you know, particularly during Pride Month. You know, Molly, aka Red, aka Jack, definitely, you know, makes a deliberate, is dressed as a man undercover, helping their family move across country, but then does that again by choice, because they, and then once they move to Portland and, you know, works in the mills, not in the mills, if only, works as a chumping lumber, as a choice, because that's how they felt most alive. So I was really debating how to gender the character Red in my discussion of it, the story.
Right. No, and I you know, I have trouble with it too. I mean, and that's one of the things that made me really want to write it, is that, you know, like I definitely have some identity questions about myself, and, you know, fiction is like the best way for me to like work through this stuff, even if I'm not like, you know, like I'm not sitting there like pouring myself into the page and then dissecting like, well, what does this mean? It's just more like, I don't know, certain experiences. Like I feel like I can, in this book at least, like I understand the concept of like questioning, like, you know, where on the spectrum do I fit, and like, what am I? Who am I? And yeah, so it just felt, you know, I found the ways to set it up where Red was, you know, dressing as Jack and becoming Jack, and then, yeah, just like planning that thing of like where they're more happy and more fulfilled as Jack, and like life just feels better. And, you know, is that an instance of because it opens so many more doors, or because it just feels right? And, you know, I wanted that sort of confusion in there. And also the fact that, you know, like we did, like you said, we didn't have terms for things like this back then. So it's very much like, you know, while it's a thing that was around, it certainly not to the degree that it is now. So sort of having that, I don't know. It was a very tricky book to write, because I didn't want, you know, like I'm not trans, so I did not feel qualified to write a trans narrative. I'm definitely like questioning, so I felt qualified to write a narrative where a character is questioning. And I just, you know, I got sensitivity readers and you know, my editor, Andrea, helped a lot to like, again, like, you know, make sure, tell me when I'm screwing up, and, you know, make sure I don't, like, so I work really hard on this book, because I like, not only do I want it to be a good book, but I want it to be a book that, you know, is not gross, for lack of a better term. Like, I don't want it to be exploitative. You know, like, the whole Red Jack thing is not, you know, like there's that movie that came out like with Michelle Rodriguez called like The Assignment.
Oh God. Yeah.
Yeah. And, you know, it was like, you know, I don't want anything to come anywhere near that. Like, I want to tell a story that's, these people have always existed. The trans people have always existed, and non-binary people, and but doing it through this lens of like revenge stories and historical fiction. To a certain degree, I think it really helped to do it that way because it was such an unknown back then. I would feel woefully unqualified to like do this story set in the present day. But I think because it's through, maybe it's just the lens of the past, like represents my own kind of ignorance, or, all the blank spots in my education. And that's what makes most sense for me. I don't know. But yeah, it's a tricky question. And, that's my best explanation is just that, Red and Jack don't really know who they are. And I do now, but yeah, it took me writing 4 whole issues and then poring over the 5th one to finally figure out who they are.
Oh, is this is this an ongoing series or limited?
It's limited. It goes to 5.
Oh, okay. Got it. So we're up to issue 3 right now, which I've read.
Yeah.
I'm really excited about the particular historical setting that you're using, and that you have a combination of life at sea as well as, in the city of Portland, and you even have some, cross-country migrant. I don't know if I should call them Sooners, perhaps Sooner experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what kind of historical research did you do for this? Because there's so much going on.
The majority of it was based around Portland and making sure that I, to some degree, got it right. There's unfortunately the 1890s is a weird period because it's that weird period where the photos that we have are like very sparse and everything is, still largely attributed to who wrote it down and what endured. So the whole reason the Shanghai tunnels narrative, the way it is now, has popped up is because somebody popped up at the right time and had this like batch of stories that they told about it, and it became cemented as this like actual fact. So it was a lot of digging through that to figure out, okay, what's real and what is just like some barfly story, and sort of figuring out, just like the way the town was arranged back then, like, just running across weird quirks, like the whole idea of Portland is a big bicycle city now. But back when the story is set, the Senate Saloon used to send their women out on bicycles to drum up business, and it was they were seen as such sordid women that like upstanding women stopped riding bicycles for years and years in Portland.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. So like, and once I read that, I was like, oh, I got to do something. Like, that's just too good. So there's a lot of that, a lot of nautical history and studying Shanghaiing. But yeah, and then just a lot of general history too, and I still make mistakes on that. Like, I think there was a scene, I started writing it where a character is getting out of a car, like a really old timey car. And then I was like, wait a minute, like there weren't even, like, I had to go and check to, like, because that period of time is so fuzzy. I was like, well, maybe 1894, there'd be a car rolling around. Like, that sort of makes sense to me, but in fact, it wasn't. So, yeah, I like to build all my stories on top of a foundation of reality. And then that way, whatever kind of nuts stuff we do with it at least feels truthy. But there's a lot of actual historical characters in the book. like Liverpool Liz is a real person, and she ran that saloon. And we have some other characters popping up who are part of the, you know, the Portland Shanghaiing industry. So that was like a weird thing, like writing actual people. I mean, and people who made it their business to not really spread their business around. So at a certain point, I just had to kind of take, you know, the small amount of facts I had and extrapolate from there.
I wish there was, and perhaps a Portland expert could tell me, but I wish there was a book that you could look at. Like in New York, there's this really famous history book called Low Life that is a history of the people in the lower economic classes in New York City.
Right.
You know, and I just keep thinking about if there was a Portland book, I would absolutely know about that bicycle story because that's amazing.
Yeah, that's just, yeah. I mean, the bikes became a much bigger thing in my story once I found that out, much to Josh's chagrin, because I had him, not only did I have him drawing horses, then I was like, oh, by the way, we have a bicycle gang now. So,
dude, you had him drawing ships. You had him drawing giant tall ships. You're a cruel, cruel writer, my friend.
I mean, you know, there's a reason like you don't see the ship like full on a lot in that book, because Josh is smart and he knew how to draw around it.
Yeah, it's a freaking nightmare. How did you guys get paired up for this book?
We met on Tumblr. One of us started following the other, and then the other followed back, and I was just like looking at the pages he had been posting on Tumblr, and they were all amazing. And I kind of thought he'd be right for Shanghai, but I just wanted to work with him on something, because I was like, this dude's going to only get better. And yeah, I think I sent him a couple ideas, but Shanghai was the one that he was most into. And you know, Josh is like, I think he had just graduated from SVA like the year before. So, he certainly wasn't expecting to get approached, I think, and my stature was pretty low back then, but you know, still, I think it was enough that he was willing to take a chance on me.
That's awesome. And then your colorist is Hassan Autism?
No. Haas is lettering. Josh draws and colors.
Josh does his own colors. Well, the colors on this book are amazing.
I know, right?
You have just wow. Like,
and he wasn't going to color the book either.
I'm sorry?
Like, we had initially hired somebody to color the book, and they had to drop out, and our pitch had already been picked up by Image. So I was like, dude, like, they like your colors. Like, maybe you should just color the whole thing. And Josh was like, yeah, I hate my colors. Like, I hate coloring. But yeah, like, he's so good at coloring. It's like, this book would look nowhere near as good if we had gotten someone else to color it.
Yeah, they're really, really outstanding. I would definitely put it on my list of some of the top coloring work of the year that I've seen. The way that they're handling all the dark, there's so much darkness, and you can still see what's happening, and there's so much red, but it's not an indistinct mass. And you have the sun. You have the contrast between the blood and the sky and the water, and yet it's all very murky, but it's readable, and it's so dramatic. It's so great.
Yeah, I got really, really lucky.
Well, you know, one of the other things that I really loved about Shanghai Red is when you have a moment in a later issue where you get to sort of pull back and really look at the city of Portland and at how the Shanghai industry, you know, was really part of Portland. I know that it was a significant part of the economy in New York for a point in time as well. And that you sort of see like the contrast between the world in which your characters are living in and the world in which the people who are running the city are living in, and how it's the brutality that your characters are enduring that is the financial engine for the splendor and remove of the people who run the city. And I think that's really important thing to show folks when it comes to historical fiction.
Yeah, and so much of this book was about people in power just looking the other way. Like, Shanghai went on in Portland until the 1920s, like well past when other towns were still doing it, and it's because it was just the people who ran the city were friends with people who used to be crimps and ran boarding houses. Like, it was just so ingrained in the city of Portland that it felt like at a certain point we had to be like, here's who's responsible. And also, like, I just kind of, I think with revenge stories, there's a tendency to be like, there's a straight line, and as soon as I get to the end of this line, then everything's fine. And I always find that things are way more complicated than that, and especially for Red, like, she has this list of people that she wants to get rid of in order to, like, make sure this doesn't happen to anybody anymore. And it's pointed out to her, like, you're basically going to have to kill everybody who's running the city, because as you take down one of these people, someone else is going to show back up, and they'll get the same carte blanche treatment because their money is lining these people's pockets.
Well, I'm on board for it, obviously, because this is definitely cost, like, this unidirectional class war that's being waged against people. I did a little bit of research. There was what actually reduced Shanghai in America, although it seems like Portland was a holdout. But there was the Siemens Act of 1915, which was passed under the Wilson administration because of increased lobbying on the part of unionized mariners. And the Siemens Union was very racially diverse, an integrated union at a time when many unions were not. And they lobbied really hard for essentially a Bill of Rights for seafarers, which got passed in 1915. And I guess it took a little while longer for Portland to get its shit together. But I really wanted to know, like, what was it that made this really horrific thing at least predominantly end in America?
Yeah, and that was, that was one of the things I discovered in my research was that, before that act, sailors were seen as the scum of the earth. Like, everybody, they were just like the one class of people that everybody felt A-okay about kicking around. And they were subjected to, like, horrible conditions. And the way the laws were written, they couldn't do anything about it. If any of them abandoned ship, they'd be locked up and thrown in jail. There were no extenuating circumstances. And like, it's just like to be thrown in with this lot of people when you're not a sailor. Like the sort of, that was, what I thought would be interesting is, like, Red, has no experience with this. She grew up in the middle of the country. Like, she's, never seen the ocean. And now, she somehow has to continue to make a life out there. And there's no way she can get away. And the ship's captain can do whatever. Like, records were barely existent. So, if you beat somebody to death and just toss them overboard, like, who's going to care? Nobody. And the fact that it took that long, basically for somebody to stand up and say, actually, sailors are human beings also, it was just kind of astounding.
Also, by that point in history, you didn't need as many sailors to man a boat because they had gone over to steam. Right. But I do still say, like, huge credit to this goes to the fact that the sailors unionized, and that they unionized not just white sailors but white and black sailors together to have enough power to be able to. The interesting other fun fact, at least to me, that the senator who had put out the legislation was from Wisconsin, was La Follette, because if you were from a coastal state, you were in the pocket of the shipping company. So it took someone from Wisconsin where this was probably not as much of an issue. But yeah, and again, like I really do want to emphasize to our listeners who might not have read this comic yet, like this is a really bloody, brutal revenge story. It is exciting as well as emotional. I definitely think the way you approach the character's trauma in the book is an important part of it, and that really, like, the horror is the horror of her own psychological trauma, right?
Yeah, and that wasn't even a thing that I had planned for. It was just something that happened in the writing of the first issue. I think that first scene where she's like eating down below with everyone else, and suddenly, like, yeah, she just sees like she's surrounded by blood and a dude floating there. Like, yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know. Like, you come up with these concepts and they sound really cool, and then the longer you live with them, the more you start to think about, like, well, what does this, like, really all mean? So, like, I didn't want to just do another, here's an untouchable badass, like, tearing her way through, all these people, and at the end, she gets a happy ending and everybody's great. Like, I wanted, like, even though she has killed people before, it wasn't egregious. Like, it was to stay alive, and this is something completely different, and the trauma of having to, like, live with that and see the results of what you did, sort of, she's trapped on this boat. Like, she can't just, like, walk away and be like, well, I'll forget about this. Like, that boat ride back to Portland is, another 7-8 months. So she's surrounded by all the worst things she could have done.
Right. I appreciate that being in the story too, rather than going, like, straight up supernatural, at least at this point. Perhaps
no, yeah, it doesn't. Yeah, no. I mean, that seems like it's hard to figure out how to represent that stuff in comics in a way that isn't hokey. But yeah, having those sort of, like, dream visions. I mean, once I saw the first one that Josh did, it made me that much more confident about doing others, because I was like, well, he did this in the best possible. Some artists could have done it in a way that really was, like, really hokey and really stunk up the joint, but, like, Josh did it in a way that I was like, no, this totally fits everything and is horrifying. Which, that's hard to sell. Like, if you just have, like, a one panel sort of hallucination and still make it effective. But that, that gave me permission to explore that further.
So how do you determine, like, what's the right level of gore for a particular story?
This one just, I don't know. I mean, it's just things feel a certain way, and this, I think it's because of the time period. I don't know, really. I mean, I just started doing it and it felt right. I mean, I think it's so much of it is generated from how much anger is kind of the engine of this book. And, that's all that Red is running on for that first, those first couple issues, because that's all she has. And just, like, I don't know, it seemed like the easiest way to kind of spell it out, rather than to have a character just, like, I didn't want her to, like, give speeches that sort of spell out, like, here's all the things you did to me, and, here's the flowery explanation of, like, what it did to me. I felt like a better explanation of, like, here's what you did to me is that she can go around doing these things and still, like, live with herself. That she finds a way to process it and make it seem like something she has to continue doing, even after the first, that first assault just, like, horrifies the hell out of her. She finds a way to look past it and keep going. So yeah, I don't know if that's an answer or not, but.
No, that absolutely is. Well, I I want to also just shout out that my dad really enjoyed the comics because I wanted to get his viewpoint on them. He's a really hard sell on most fiction in general, particularly tough audience on historical fiction because he always knows too much to be able to sit with other people's work sometimes, and is also he's just not historically been a comics reader. I did not get my love of comics from my dad, and he really was on board with it. He's excited about it, and he's subscribing. So
awesome. Yeah, no, yeah. I both of these books. I mean, I feel like I don't know why, but something about them, like I feel like I've definitely like leveled up with both of these books, and like I don't know, I haven't. Yeah, it's just like some books, like I mean, I love all my books, but some books are just like. This one's going to be a little bit harder, but both of these, like, I mean, they've been incredibly hard to write and create, but I also feel like they also really have the potential to connect with people, that they're not, just like kind of niche books. I mean, I feel like we're doing interesting stuff in both books that you don't see a lot in a lot of comics. So
yes.
I don't know. Yeah, no, I just feel really, it's a ton of work. It's pretty much my entire life right now. It's just like team managing these things as well as designing stuff for it, and as well as staying on top of my other deadlines. But it's easy to keep going because they're just so good. And that's also like, I would never say that about my stuff. Like, it's really hard to get me to not crap all over my work, but both of these books, it's been incredibly easy for me to go like, no, they're actually both really, really good, and you'll like them if you like good stuff.
Well, I'm glad you're at a point in your career where you feel like you can just finally say that, right?
Yeah, it only took 8 years.
Yeah, exactly, and some Eisner nominations, whatever. But
whatever.
But also for me, reading Shanghai Red was the first thing I picked up from the two things you'd sent over to me. And it being Pride Month, and I was, wanted to just book LGBTQ guests this whole month, I was kind of expecting that there would end up being just a lot of pink and glitter. And I'm really glad that in general, queer comics have moved away. It felt for a while like queer narratives and pop culture in general were all, when I was younger and it was the 90s, it was all sort of sob stories, and I had no interest in engaging with them. And then more recently, people were like, actually, we can do comedy, we can be fun, we can be sweet, we deserve these kinds of happy stories too. And hooray, we do. But it's also kind of resulted in a lot of things that have a very similar visual aesthetic and are often very pink. And That's great, but that's not the only flavor. So I was really excited to have, a comic by a queer creator with, characters somewhere along the spectrum of queerness that is not at all pink and sweet and
yeah.
No, I mean, and especially with Crowded, I think we all as a team agreed that like we didn't want a sort of homogenous vision, so we want a variety of body types and a variety of queerness and personalities and color palettes. So, and I think because our, I mean, I don't know everyone's orientation on the team, but I know, at least a couple of us are queer. So, I feel like that fits in. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested in exploring. Like I said, I don't want to make stories that are about being gay or about being bi. I want to make stories where the main character is gay or bi or something else, and just have that be part of who they are and not make it the entire selling point of the book, which it feels like we've gotten away from that. But yeah, I mean, I'm just, I'm making the stories that I want to see, and the kind of variety that I would like represented out there. And I'm luckily in a position where I can decide to do that and somebody will agree to put it out. So I'm just trying to make the most of it.
And thank you for using your powers to help us continue to wage class war on the ruling class. So, in the form of fiction.
Anytime, yeah. No, I mean, I've been doing it all my life, so I might as well like put a little bit in my work.
Well, thanks for joining us again, Christopher. Let our listeners know where's the best place to keep up with your work.
Twitter is probably the best. I'm at xtop, XTOP. I also maintain a website, which is ChristopherSebela.com. That's about it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And
thanks for having me.
I can't wait to see the next issues coming out too. So you got me hooked. You got my dad, tough crowd, interested, and I think we're all winning on this. So
awesome. That's good to know.
Have a great week.
All right, you too. Thanks.
So for our listeners, next week, I believe next week we're going to be joined by some of the creative team from the new original graphic novel called Cardboard Kingdom, which is a really cool all-ages comic with Katie Schenkel will be one of the folks joining us. Katie is a really great podcaster in her own right, so I know she'll be an excellent guest. And, she was on the show before to talk about Moonlighters. I just forgot. But she'll be back to talk about this, and we'll probably have some of the other talent from that book on as well. And we will have more awesome guests for you from here and on into the future. So again, thanks for listening. And thank you for supporting the podcast. If you started to get onto this late, you will be able to catch up with it on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. And it'll also be at our Blog Talk Radio, and on Graphic Policy, graphicpolicy.com. I'm going to actually have a piece out on reviewing Shanghai Red. Should be out this week, I imagine, on the website as well. So thank you for joining us. And as Brett and I like to say, keep it geeky. Oh, right. And again, I'm on Twitter, ELANA_Brooklyn. I can't believe I messed up my sign off just for the sake of reminding you of my Twitter account, but it's me. That's the kind of thing I would stay on to do. Again, ELANA_Brooklyn. That's me on Twitter. Keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.